Whispers in the Glass, Part 1, The Antique Shop. The old antique shop stood at the end of a deserted alley, its wooden sign creaking in the cold wind. Daniel Parker, a collector of rare artifacts, stepped inside, his boots echoing on the dusty floor. The scent of aged wood and forgotten memories filled the air. "Looking for something special?" croaked the shopkeeper, an elderly man with sunken eyes. Daniel scanned the shelves of eerie porcelain dolls, rusted pocket watches, and cracked paintings. Then his gaze landed on a snow globe sitting alone on a shelf, its glass slightly fogged. Inside, a miniature Victorian village lay beneath a swirl of frozen flakes. Tiny houses. A small clock tower. Snow-covered trees. And figures. Little people, carved with unsettling precision, their expressions frozen in what looked like terror. Daniel picked it up, tilting it slightly. The snow swirled violently, almost unnaturally fast. For a moment, he thought he saw the figures move. "How much for this?" he asked. The shopkeeper's face darkened. "That one is not for sale." Daniel smirked. "Everything has a price." The old man hesitated before whispering, $50, but you must never shake it at night. Daniel laughed, tossing a bill on the counter. "Superstitions, huh?" The shopkeeper didn't laugh. Daniel left, the cold wind biting at his skin. As he walked home, he swore he heard tiny voices whispering from the snow globe, so faint they almost blended with the wind. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? Whispers in the Glass, Part 2, The Screams. Daniel placed the snow globe on his desk, admiring its craftsmanship. The tiny village inside was eerily realistic, the delicate houses, the frozen lake, even the tiny footprints in the snow. He gave it a gentle shake. The white flakes swirled, covering the little town in a fresh blanket of winter. Then he heard it. A faint, distant scream. Daniel froze. The sound was tiny, almost like a whisper from inside the glass. He leaned in, pressing his ear against the globe. Silence. His heart pounded. I must be imagining things. Chuckling nervously, he placed the globe on his nightstand and went to bed. At exactly midnight, he woke to a sharp, echoing knock. 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 He sat up, his breath heavy. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the streetlight outside. His eyes darted to the door. Nothing. Then he heard it again. Knock. 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 But this time it came from the snow globe. Daniel's stomach twisted. Slowly, he reached out and lifted the glass sphere. The snow inside had settled, but something was different. The tiny figures, they had moved. Before, they were scattered across the village. Now, they were all huddled near the center, facing upward. Their faces, once carved in terror, now looked more desperate. Daniel's hand trembled as he lifted the globe closer. Then, all at once, they screamed. A high-pitched, piercing shriek exploded from inside the globe, rattling the windows. Daniel stumbled back, dropping it onto the bed. The screaming stopped immediately. Silence. Shaking, Daniel picked up the globe again. The tiny figures were back in their original spots. The village looked peaceful. Had he imagined it? A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Then he noticed something that made his breath hitch. The front door of one of the miniature houses was open, and a tiny set of footprints led from the house toward the edge of the globe. Toward him. Whispers in the Glass, Part 3, The Escape. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned the snow globe over in his hands, staring at the tiny footprints leading toward the glass. "This isn't real," he whispered. Yet his hands trembled as he set the globe down on his desk. The room felt colder, the air heavier, like something unseen was pressing against his chest. He needed to test it. Slowly, he reached out and shook the globe. The snow swirled wildly inside, spinning into a blizzard. The moment the last flake settled, a sound echoed through the room. A whisper. Faint. Desperate. Daniel leaned in. His breath fogged up the glass. The tiny figures in the village were no longer in their usual places. They were all gathered in front of the clock tower. One figure, a man in a long coat, stood apart from the rest, facing upward. Facing Daniel. And then it moved. A tiny flicker, a twitch of its arm. Daniel jerked back, his chair scraping the floor. His heartbeat thundered. No, no, this is a trick. A mechanical illusion. Then the whispering grew louder. More urgent. The voices, many voices, overlapping, crying out. Help us! Please, let us out, before it returns. Daniel's breath hitched. What returns? A sharp crack made him jump. He looked down. A tiny fracture had formed on the inner glass of the globe. The figures inside started running, tiny feet pattering over the snow, rushing toward the edges. Then he noticed something else. The clock tower. Its hands, which had always been frozen in place, were moving. Slowly ticking toward midnight. Daniel's stomach twisted. He grabbed the globe and turned it upside down. Maybe there was a hidden switch, a winding mechanism. But the moment he flipped it, a new detail made his blood run cold. The bottom of the globe wasn't smooth glass. It was wood. Tiny wooden planks, like a trapdoor. And in the center, a handle. Daniel's fingers hovered over it. His mind screamed not to touch it, not to open it, not to. But the whispering turned into screaming. He's coming. Please? The clock tower's hands ticked closer to 12. Daniel had seconds to decide. Then, the lights in his room flickered. The air turned ice cold. And behind him, something breathed. Whispers in the Glass, Part 4, The Midnight Visitor. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A presence loomed behind him. Cold. Heavy. Like a shadow pressing against his back. The snow globe trembled in his hands. Inside, the tiny figures screamed silently, their mouths frozen open in horror. The clock tower's hands ticked closer to midnight. He's coming. The voices inside the globe shrieked. Daniel spun around. The lights flickered violently. The air smelled of something old, something rotten. His reflection in the window was distorted, wrong. His own face looked back, but behind him, a tall, shadowy figure loomed in the darkness. Its fingers were long. Too long. Its face, missing. Just a black void where eyes and a mouth should be. And then, the clock inside the globe struck midnight. Ding! The glass in Daniel's hand cracked, a thin, jagged fracture spreading across the surface. Ding! The figures inside fell to their knees, clutching their heads in agony. Ding! A whisper right next to Daniel's ear. Let me out! The shadow lunged. Daniel screamed, stumbling back. His hand slipped. The snow globe fell. It hit the floor. Shattered. A deafening silence filled the room. The tiny village lay in ruins, its people frozen in place, their tiny faces twisted in silent horror. Snowflakes spilled across the wooden floor like scattered ash. And then, a breath. Not from Daniel. Slowly, he looked up. The figure from the globe, the tall man with the missing face, was standing in his room. Real. Looming. Watching. Daniel tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The air was thick, suffocating. Then, with an eerie slowness, the figure raised one hand and pointed at the broken glass. Daniel's eyes followed. The tiny people inside the snow globe were gone. Footprints, small, human footprints, led away from the shattered remains across his floor. His pulse thundered. Where had they gone? A gust of freezing wind blew through the room. The lights died. In the darkness, he heard them. Tiny footsteps. Rushing toward him. Daniel opened his mouth to scream. But the sound never came. The next morning, the antique shop door creaked open. The old shopkeeper looked up as a stranger stepped inside. A tall man in a long coat. His face was blank. Featureless. He placed something on the counter. A new snow globe. Inside was a tiny village. A tiny clock tower. And, at its center, a tiny figure of a man. His mouth frozen open in a silent scream. The shopkeeper sighed. Another one. He picked up the globe and placed it on the shelf with all the others. Waiting. For the next collector. For the next fool. For the next prisoner.